Why did Saudi Arabia do this if we assume that they did? And I understand it's a big assumption. But there was the murder of another dissident many years ago, a dissident duke after the French Revolution in Paris. And Talleyrand, the foreign minister, said it was worse than a crime, it was a blunder. Meaning it just seems to be causing all these problems for the Saudis. Do you think they anticipated this?
I don't know if they anticipated the blowback, Fareed, but I assume the reason they did it was because they thought that they could get away with it. Jamal Khashoggi was somebody who annoyed the Saudi royal family because he criticized them, and they don't like criticism, and so they thought they could get away with this. And why would they think they could get away with this? Well, maybe because they look at their primary patron in Washington. Donald Trump is somebody who refers to the media as the enemy of the people. He has nothing but praise for dictators. He says he loves Kim Jong-un. He praises Duterte in the Philippines for the way he's handling the drug problem, which is by sending out death squads. And he has been particularly enamored of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. That's where Riyadh was the first place where Donald Trump took a foreign trip. And he has been very supportive of the Saudis, even as they have become very assertive in the region in ways that are not always smart. Look at their war in Yemen. Look at their feud with Qatar. Look at the fact that last year they actually kidnapped the prime minister of Lebanon. Now they're in a feud with Canada, and we're not standing up for Canada. We're not standing up for these other countries that are getting the rough treatment from Saudi Arabia. And so I assume they thought, well, we can get rid of this pesky reporter and Donald Trump won't care. But what we're finding out now is whether Donald Trump cares or not, a lot of people in Washington do care.
Tariq, you not only a great scholar of the Middle East, but you grew up in Saudi Arabia. You were there till you were 16 years old. What I'm struck by is Jamal Khashoggi is not some radical, anti-monarchical crazy. I mean, he was somebody, I've known him for 15, 16 years. He was a very moderate, incremental reformer, worked for Turkey, Turkey bin Faisal, who was the Saudi ambassador to both the U.S. and Britain. What does this tell us about what's going on in Saudi Arabia?
Well, so obviously stipulating that we don't know what happened with Jamal, but it increasingly looks bad. I think you're absolutely right. Jamal was not a dissident from some marginalized community in Saudi Arabia. He was actually a member of that establishment. And so to see him run so afoul of that establishment, or run afoul of the monarchy, suggests that there is a deep cleavage within that establishment. If Jamal Khashoggi is now the enemy of the state, then there's a serious problem in Saudi Arabia. And it suggests that there's lots of others in Saudi Arabia at the elite level who have similar views and who are consequently similarly unhappy with the regime. If you read Jamal's columns in the Washington Post, this was not a guy who was against the Saudi monarchy. This was a guy who was saying, he was basically giving advice to the Saudi monarchy, saying, look, you should do this, you should do that, you should open up a little bit. But his overriding concern was actually the preservation of that monarchy. You know, some people now would even criticize Jamal. If you go back and look over Jamal's entire intellectual production, right, he's said a lot of things that we wouldn't characterize as liberal, right? In 2016, when the Saudi government executed Nimr al-Nimr, who was a Shia preacher, Jamal Khashoggi was actually quite in favor of that. He supported that. He said that this person was a traitor. So again, it's this guy, because he was a faithful son of Saudi Arabia, a member of what I would call maybe its loyal opposition in self-imposed exile, it's puzzling to me why they saw him as such a dramatic threat.
We've got a short period of time in this segment. What should the U.S. do?
But that, I would say that's why Jamal Khashoggi is more dangerous than somebody who's all the way out. He had real currency with the people Mohammed bin Salman cared about, which is exactly the folks in Washington and newspaper columnists. But the U.S. now has to draw a clear line. I think Saudi Arabia is counting on outrage fatigue, that this will pass, as so many outrages have, and we have to draw a line. Congress has to activate and act against Saudi Arabia, even if the Trump White House won't.
Anne-Marie, you were saying that you think the U.S. should get very tough, enact sanctions against Saudi Arabia. But Is that likely to happen? I think there are a lot of people who look at this and think Saudi Arabia is so rich, it has so much money. Inevitably, there is going to be what you described as the fatigue. You already see it with the Saudi Investment Conference. While media organizations have pulled out, none of the big banks have pulled out. None of the big financial institutions that are going there hoping to get Saudi money have pulled out. Won't this pass?
Although Uber has pulled out, which I actually also think is interesting in terms of their perception and their customer base, because younger people are pushing. I think that's the bet, right? That's the bet on the part of the Saudi government. This will pass. It is also in Donald Trump's approach to the world, where he says every nation pursues its own interests. We pursue ours, others pursue others. This is what happens. The Russians murder people in Britain. The Saudis murder people in Turkey. But at some point, there has to be a line. The idea of living in a world where governments just, without any restraint, murder their political opponents is not a world that ultimately the United States wants to live in. I don't think that the White House will push back, but I do think there's a bipartisan coalition in Congress, as there has been against Russia for what they've done in Britain in particular, that can draw that line. But so,
Ivo, talk about the extent to which this is complicated by the fact that we don't have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. We don't have assistant secretaries at the State Department. I mean, is part of this that, you know, diplomacy isn't just about what the president says to the king. It's what is going on a day-to-day basis between two countries.
Yeah, it very much is. In some ways, the policy that the United States has pursued since the beginning of this administration really towards Saudi Arabia really has been held by a very small group of people. The president, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and that's about it. There's no ambassador, as you said. In fact, no one has been nominated. There's no assistant secretary. The Secretary of State, Greg Tillerson, tried to drive the policy in a different direction. Of course, he knew Saudi Arabia extraordinarily well as the former CEO of Exxon, and no one in the White House listened. In fact, he was sacked. Secretary Mattis has been trying to drive it in a different direction when it came to the issue of Qatar, where, of course, we have more than 10,000 servicemen, and yet Saudi Arabia has a major confrontation with the Qataris on the question of the future of policy towards the Arab world. And yet, policy in Washington is determined by a very small group of people when it comes to Saudi Arabia, which is why even if there is a pushback, as we're seeing from President Trump in the last few days, I don't think it's going to last. The reality is that there has been this strong relationship with MBS and the White House, and that's what they're counting on. And unless there's a change in Saudi Arabia, I don't see the change coming from Washington.
Tariq, the Saudis have responded very vigorously, even to the hint of any kind of Western retaliation.
Absolutely. This morning there was a statement from it's a Masdar Mas'oul, a responsible source, authoritative source. It was a statement released by the Saudi news agency, but they wouldn't tell us who the source is, that said basically that, yes, these attempts to harm Saudi Arabia will not be dealt with lightly. We'll respond to them as vigorously or even more vigorously than they are. So, you know, if I think Ivo is absolutely right that there is this close relationship between Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and President Trump and his son-in-law. But if there's anything that's likely to disrupt that, it's exactly this kind of posturing, right? Both of these sides seem to be very sensitive and prone to taking slights very seriously. And so this could be a kind of escalation in that relationship. It's just, can I just say, it's kind of dramatic, right? About when Mohammed bin Salman came here earlier this year, right? He was being celebrated as a reformer, right? He was like, it was like going from being Steve Jobs to being Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. So it really is just, you've got to wonder, Mohammed bin Salman must be looking at this and wondering what has happened to my reputation, because all of these things are self-inflicted.
Very briefly, Max, but you do have an unusual situation where a close American ally seems to have, again, alleged to have murdered an American resident, a Washington Post columnist. The three of his kids, I think, are American citizens. in a NATO country, in Turkey. And the United States seems not particularly concerned, at least the administration.
This is so outrageous, Reed. This is the complete abdication of American moral leadership, something that I've long associated with the Republican Party in particular. I mean, that's part of the reason why I became a Republican in the 1980s. And it's so shocking to me to see a Republican president who has no interest in leading on these issues. Donald Trump seems to view the presidency, he seems to view the United States as basically being like the Trump Organization, a way to make money. And so he says, you know, we can't do anything to Saudi Arabia because we're selling them $110 billion worth of arms. Well, we're not actually, okay? The figure is actually much, much lower than that. But even if it were 110 billion, are we willing to sell out all of our principles, everything that we stand for as a country, in order to increase arms sales? That's the kind of amoral behavior we expect from a China or a Russia. America's strength has always been that we stand for something greater. That's been part of our appeal. That's been part of our power. And Donald Trump is sacrificing what makes America great, supposedly to make America great again, but he doesn't understand what that greatness is all about.